Hi everybody, it's Courtney and welcome back. Today I'm going to be using the Sentiments Wreath Stamp by Spellbinders, and this unfortunately is another discontinued item. Times are tough this year and I've had to shop my stash for a lot of items that I'm using in this particular series. So today's theme is embossing techniques. So I'm going to go ahead and stamp this out onto a piece of white cardstock. This is heavyweight cardstock that I'm using just because I plan on adding a lot of heat and I know it's going to warp. So I'm going to stamp this with a Copic Safe ink. It doesn't have to be a great impression. I just have to be able to see the image. It's going to be covered up later. So because I don't have a ton of embossing powders, I'm going to color some of these areas. So for the inside of the ribbons, or I guess the ribbons that are around the wreath, the inside of them, I want these to appear white. So remember guys, anything that is white still has shadows to it. So I'm just going to add a little bit of shading to either side with some cool grays and kind of fade that out to white, leaving some white space there. So that way, once I add my embossing, it will still appear white with just a little bit of shadow. For the outside of these ribbons, they're kind of have like a, I don't know, like a border around them. I'm going to use some reds and I'm adding my shading in the same places as I added my grays. I did go in right with my darkest color. This is not a cardstock that I typically use when I'm Copic coloring. So I just want to make sure that it's not going to bleed. So by adding just a little bit of pigment down, just a little bit of Copic ink, I can kind of minimize that if there is any. So I continued coloring the ribbon, just the ribbon. That's the only thing I'm worried about right now for the entire wreath. Then we can add our embossing. And this is where we're going to get all of the color and shine and texture in this wreath. So I'm going to start off with a green, and I'm not sure how to say that, but I will link it below. It actually has kind of like gold specks in it. It's very, very pretty. I treated my panel with a anti-static tool, and I'm going to be using an Emboss It pen by Ranger. They come two in a pack, one black, one clear, and I'm using the clear one here, and I am just coloring in each one of these leaves. Now, the Emboss It pen is basically a sticky ink that comes in a pen form. However, I find that it does dry a little bit faster than if I were to use a Versamark ink pad. So I'm only working on one little section at a time. I'll sprinkle on that embossing powder and then move on to the next section and sprinkle on some more embossing powder. I'm not heat setting it in between just because I figure why add even more warping to this paper that I'm already going to have. So you can see, I don't know whether you guys can see, but some of the areas weren't filled in perfectly. I'll fix that after I heat set it. I'm not really too concerned about it being perfect, and you'll see why towards the end. So I continued around to the last section and again sprinkled on some more of that embossing powder, which is really, really pretty. And I know this whole card is going to be very difficult to see all of the effects that you get from the embossing on camera, but it is very, very pretty once it's heat set. So I did make sure that my heat gun was heated up for about 30 seconds or so before bringing that to the paper, just to kind of minimize the amount of warping that I'm going to get. I'm going to get the warping anyway, just because I'm going to continuously add heat to this. So once that was heat set, and I did give it about 5 or 10 seconds to cool down a little bit, I'm going to once again treat that with my anti-static tool, and I'm just going to go back in with that Emboss It pen to fix up any areas that I may have missed. So some of the edges of the leaves weren't totally filled in, some of the tips weren't filled in, and some leaves I totally missed altogether. So I just kind of quickly filled in those areas, and like I said, they don't have to be perfect, and you'll see why. Sprinkled on a little bit more of the embossing powder, fixed up some more of those areas. Again, just working in smaller sections because this pen does dry a little bit faster. If you wait too long to sprinkle on that embossing powder, it might not stick the way you want it to. So once all of those areas were fixed and cleaned up, I can just pour my embossing powder back into my jar. That way I have very little to no waste, provided I don't spill it like I sometimes do. And then once again, I can heat set that. Now for these red areas, I don't have red embossing powder. You can certainly use red embossing powder for this, but I don't have any. That's why I colored them red. But I still want them to have the texture and the shine of the embossing powder. So I'm going to use clear. So I'm going to do the same thing. Once again, I treated that with my anti-static tool. I'm going to go in and I'm just going to go over those areas with the Emboss It pen and then sprinkle on some clear embossing powder and then move on to the next ribbon. Again, working in very small sections at a time, just making sure that my embossing powder really sticks. Letting my embossing tool, I use a Wagner heat tool, by the way. I know I get some questions about that, and I love it. I don't have the new one. I've had this one for about 2 or 3 years, and I feel no need to replace it because it works great. But I do let it heat up for about 30 seconds or so, bring that to the paper and heat set that clear embossing powder. Now for the middle, again, I wanted this to appear white, but I wanted a little bit of shimmer. So I'm going to make my own embossing powder. Well, not make my own, but I'm going to mix my own. So I have some Perfect Pearls there, and that's just the color Perfect Pearl. So it's basically just white with some pearl. So I'm taking some clear embossing powder and mixing in some of the Perfect Pearls into it. So it's going to be still clear, but I'm just going to have a little bit of that pearlescent effect to it. It's going to still work the same way as regular embossing powder, and you can always change the color of your embossing powder with Perfect Pearls. It's going to change the color of it, and it's also going to give you a little bit of pearl. So I'm going to go through, do the same thing as I did before. I'm just going to fill in those areas where I want this to be. And this is very, very hard to see on camera, but it does give a nice shine to it with the clear embossing, but it also leaves behind a little bit of that pearlescent look to it. So once again, I can heat set that, and here is where it's all going to come together. Right now, it kind of looks like a hot mess. It kind of looks a little bit blotchy here and there, other than the red, which is pretty much the only thing that stands out at this point. But now we are going to restamp it. You can see that I left my stamp in my MISTI. I'm going to line that back up in the corner one more time, treat that with my anti-static tool, and this time I am stamping with VersaFine Onyx Black ink, which is a black pigment ink. So I'm going to make sure that I ink up my stamp really well. I had so much warping that the top portion wasn't exactly lined up perfectly, but it's good enough because it's handmade and nothing is perfect that's handmade. So you can see once I stamp that, it all starts to come together. Once again, sprinkling on some clear embossing powder and heat setting that. Once I heat set that, you can kind of see all of the images or all of the little bits and pieces of the images kind of come to life with that bold black outline. And you have even more texture. So once that's done, I am going to die cut this with a circle die. This does have a coordinating die, or did have a coordinating die, but I didn't purchase it at the time that I got the stamp. So I'm just going to use a circle die. I'm going to end up changing my mind later, but I ran that through my Gemini, and I am going to be creating a trifold card. And I'm not really too concerned about the background because the video is all about embossing technique. So mainly I just wanted to show you what you can do with images like this with different color embossing folders. So I have my card base there, and I'm taking a piece of black cardstock and running that through an embossing folder, and it's a wood grain embossing folder, which ever since the video with embossing folders, which I think was like day 2, I believe, I've been kind of obsessed with embossing folders all over again. I've fallen in love with them all over. So I cut those down into 2 panels that are just slightly smaller than each side of my card base. So I have just a small white border on either side. I'm going to take some Tampo Mono multi-glue to adhere those down, just making sure that I do leave that small white border there. And this is where I changed my mind as far as the positioning of the wreath. So typically what I would do is I was going to glue this down onto just one flap. Doesn't matter which one, so that you can still open and close the card, obviously. But I felt like it was just a little bit too much white space left over, and I just didn't like the circle, the gigantic circle. I debated putting it into my scan and cut, but just didn't feel like setting that up because long story, but the way my craft room is set up, I have to unplug something to plug that in, and I just didn't want to do it with it. So I tried to use a different circle die that was a little bit smaller, but it was a little bit too small where it was going to cut off some of the wreath. So I ended up fussy cutting it. I debated on it because it was a lot to fussy cut, but ended up keeping it pretty simple. I just left a white border around the edge of it and got the basic shape of the wreath. I wasn't too concerned with it being perfect. I just want to kind of take away some of that white space. I did not cut the center of it though, because I want some stability there where my card opens and closes. Otherwise you would have seen that the middle of the card where it opens right in the center of the wreath, which I didn't want. So once the fussy cutting was done, I can go ahead and adhere that to my card. Like I said, I am going to put adhesive just on one half of it and adhere that to one of the panels. Now, what I like to do, and there's different ways you can do this. You can use Velcro, you can even use a magnet. But what I like to do is I like to use some Tombow Mono multi-glue on the part that is not glued down. But what I do is I add some Tombow Mono multi-glue and let it dry completely. Once it's dry, it becomes repositionable and your card will stay closed without it being permanent. So I have some ink smudges in the center. So in order to cover that up, I can use a sand eraser, which I cannot currently find because my desk is a complete disaster. I've been really pumping out these videos and still trying to do stuff for Create and Inspire. So it's been a little crazy. I am going to just add a mat to the center where I will add my greeting to my recipient. I did mat that onto some black just to make it pop a little bit more and then just glue that in the center. Now that my glue that I had added has dried to the other side of that wreath, like I said, it becomes repositionable and it will lay flat in the envelope. So that is it. That is the card for today. As always, I will leave the supplies listed in the description box below. And like I said, today's theme is embossing techniques. So I will leave a link to the next video in the description box, and I hope that you can check it out. Thanks, guys. See you tomorrow. Bye.